Let's start with today's news. Mr. Gingrich, before today's launch, you said the North Koreans should not be allowed to fire a missile and that the U.S., quote, should take whatever preemptive actions are necessary. Are you saying that President Gingrich would have taken out that missile on the launch pad?
Yes, I'm saying if you look at a new book by my co-author Bill Fortune called 1 Second After, and you look at electromagnetic pulse capabilities, which could take out one weapon, could take out a third of the electric generating capacity of the United States. We do not appreciate the scale of threat that is evolving on the planet, and North Korea is a totally irresponsible dictatorship run by a person who is clearly out of touch with reality. And I think to say, you know, we're now going to have another meeting of the UN to have another paper resolution that has meaningless effect is very dangerous. I think both with Iran and with North Korea, you have countries which could decide at any morning to try to actually use their weapons.
So you're saying that President Gingrich would have taken out
There are 3 or 4 techniques that could have been used, from unconventional forces to standoff capabilities, to say we're not going to tolerate a North Korean missile launch, period. I mean, the world's either got to decide that North Korea is utterly dangerous. And again, I'd recommend look at electromagnetic pulse, which changes which we've known about since 1958. It changes every equation about how risky these weapons are.
Governor Sanford, would you also have taken preemptive action? And do we really want to get into a shooting war with the North Koreans when they have a 1 million-member army stationed just across the DMZ, about 30 miles from the South Korean capital of Seoul?
I would always defer to my former boss, if you will, as I was a pup freshman, as he was speaker, on issues of foreign policy. But what I would say is that in the countryside of South Carolina, at some point you got to back up words with action. And as the speaker just pointed out, there have been a long series of missteps, intentional steps on North Korea's part, and little in the way of action from the standpoint of either America or international community.
If I could, Chris, one last point. We have been talking about this since the Clinton administration, right, and they have been building nuclear weapons and building better and better missiles while we keep talking. And one morning, just like 9/11, there's going to be a disaster, and people are going to look around and say, gosh, why didn't anyone think of that? Well, I'm telling you, the time to think about it's before the disaster, not afterwards.
Well, do you think that we can do anything in the UN?
I'm looking with great interest to see the president's promise of hard action, toughness come to this afternoon. I have yet to see the United Nations do anything effective with either Iran or North Korea.
Let me, Mr. Gingrich.
But may I just follow up on that thought, which is there is something fundamentally wrong with an administration that says tough action and a Secretary of Defense who says we absolutely have the capacity to shoot this thing down and no action.
Mr. Gingrich, what do you make of the president's speech today in which he called for new limits and, in fact, the elimination eventually as a goal of all nuclear weapons at the same time, as I discussed with David Axelrod, that he wants a cut in missile defense?
There's a fascinating analysis of Jimmy Carter's Notre Dame speech when he spoke at the commencement in 1977. And that was the moment in which Carter's fantasy view of the world became clear, in the beginning, I think, of the end of his administration. The president's in a world where Hamas is firing missiles every day into Israel. Iran is building nuclear weapons. And the North Koreans today, basically during his speech, fired a missile. And he has some wonderful fantasy idea that we're going to have a great meeting next year. With who? I mean, who's coming to this meeting? The Pakistanis, the Indians, the Chinese, the Russians? And what are they going to promise? And why would you believe them? I just think that it's very dangerous to have a fantasy foreign policy, and it can get you in enormous trouble. Just like giving, you know, we don't have a war on terror anymore. We don't have terrorist attacks anymore. So now Homeland Security has man-made disasters. I'm somehow not comforted with the thought that 9/11 was a man-made disaster, but not a terrorist attack. And I'm not comforted with words instead of serious systematic policies.